Hey everybody, it's Kyle from TavernTCG. I'm here with Ernest. Ernest, how you doing?
Good, good.
Good, awesome. So here, the competitive mindset, episode 2. As you guys already know, if you've seen the first one, this is all about interviewing competitive players, kind of seeing how they tick, how they think about the meta, how they deck build, just kind of really get a view into the minds of the competitive player. Who better than Ernest Patton, in my opinion? Ernest?
Well, thanks for introducing me. Just a little background about myself for those that don't know. I know I haven't been exactly very active in the community on the Force of Will page. I'm very active in the local communities, but I placed first in the largest Force of Will event outside the regionals, which was Philadelphia. They had 112 players, and I've also placed top 16 at the Force of Will regional event in Houston. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Ernest flies a little bit under the radar, I think, for the most part, except like if you're a competitive player, you know Ernest for sure. He creates some awesome decks. He's really creative, and when you talk about thinking differently, right, where, at least from a deck building perspective, who better than Ernest, in my opinion, just because we've seen a lot of really cool creative stuff come from him. So that's the first thing I want to talk about here today is right now, we're in the off season, obviously, but we're on the brink of having a new set enter the format, right? So TTW is on its way. When a new set is coming out, where do you start, right? All these new cards, where do you start?
It's definitely a whirlwind of a whirlwind. It's definitely a whirlwind when you walk into it because like a lot of players, they kind of look at the stuff and kind of look at the first couple of cards they see, and
Right.
they fall into a trap where it's like, oh, I'm gonna tunnel vision on
Right.
this concept or this
Yeah.
I guess combo
Right.
when we don't know the other pieces of the meta. If we have the whole set, we have a lot better of a picture to kind of take a grasp and I can take a step back and kind of look into the picture. How does it impact decks going into it? How does it impact the future meta per se? And I don't want to talk too much about the meta, but it's definitely something you have to take into consideration what the whole pool looks like before kind of jumping in right away.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the first traps that you'll see right off the bat is obvious synergy, right? So cards will get released that really work well together. It's very obvious, and people gravitate to that first. What I hear from a lot of other players, we had Quinn on last week, and he was talking about this too, is a lot of times the first thing to do is see which cards work really well in the current top decks. Do you take the same mindset, or do you do something a little differently?
I definitely do kind of my first approach. I look at the decks in the previous format. I look at can they carry over into the current format? Are there any big obstacles for them?
Right.
If they can be carried over, what's the most optimal way for them to build out to be more aggressive or have a better win condition, a stronger win condition? From there, I kind of just like build into okay, this is what the meta will likely transform into. What can I use to create that'll combat these tricks? And that's kind of like I guess the best approach, or the other approach is kind of coming out of left field and coming out with something really new and original
Right.
that no one's ever seen before. So
Do you shoot for that ever?
I do sometimes, but like I guess for this past format, the first thing I kind of looked at was, oh look, Moonshard works so well with Steven. How can I make that happen right away? Well, Livery of the Wind definitely can carry that over on turn 3.
Right.
But players will not expect that combo coming out on turn 3 going to game 1, so I can definitely have that surprise factor. I do sometimes like take that approach, but it only works if it's something that is not so obvious at first glance. So
Right. Yeah.
Really full-time use. So.
Do you ever spend? I know some players. So there's a few players that are very confident. They're like, okay, I'll take whatever deck has had success. I'll make sure I understand why it's successful. I'll make some tweaks and some meta calls. Then there's the other player, right, which is someone who's like, I will spend as much time as possible to find the strange, the unusual, the unexpected that can just spike a tournament. Do you ever find yourself in a trap to where you're like, I'm trying to figure out what is that weird combo? What is that weird deck that can totally get to the top?
Well, I think a lot of players like to come up with something original and new because it adds a name to the deck, a face to the deck per se, and like in like a current environment, if you have a face to the name, it really is really
Right.
cool to like see yourself like at top tables with a deck no one's known before.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, that's the guy who created the deck.
Right. Right.
But at the end of the day, I always take the numbers and kind of make sure like they align. I take the deck with the highest probability against all the matchups. So for instance, if one deck is a lot stronger than maybe like 2 other deck archetypes, I'll take that. I'll consider that deck. But now if it falls short to X, Y, Z, you always have to take kind of like the variables away and see, like, I think Quinn said it last week, where it's like, I'll take the deck with the highest probability against the meta decks. Like if it's good against 6 decks, I'll take against those 6 decks out of the 10. And I think that's kind of like the mindset most players will take going into a tournament. Like, how can I top with the highest percentage for success? Right.
Especially, yeah, we did touch on this too, is the fact that it's a long, you're playing a lot of rounds, right? So sure, there's certain decks that are fun and you're going to win some local tournaments. You might even win some 5-round, 6-round ARG tournaments that have 30 plus people, whatever. Take a deck to an event like Houston, for example, and you were at Houston, you got top 16, and take a deck there. And now it's a whole different ballgame. You're playing, I mean, I forget how many rounds it was, but you're playing a ton of rounds, and you're playing against real sharp competitive players.
Exactly.
So you got to take the statistics into account. We all want to be cute, right? But at the end of the day, if you want to win, you really, really got to start thinking what has the best chance of winning.
Opposed to what would be cute, and it might take games from players that might not expect it coming.
Right.
Sure, you'll have that X factor. Well, maybe you can take every game 1, but if you can't accept taking game 2 and 3 because of a key sideboard component, you can't afford to lose more than 1 game due to just bad luck.
Right.
In a tournament, you have to take that. You're going to tournament accepting you're going to take 1 loss. You can't afford 2. Everything else has to be really consistent in order to be able to top 8.
Right. It's funny because that's one of my problems with the Yamada deck. It's fun as hell to play. It's cool, but when they board in, because it's like a nightmare.
4 horns.
Yeah.
You're in trouble.
Right. Big trouble because horn's free. I mean, your old deck gets screwed by a free card. And so there's stuff like that where it's like, yeah, they're cute, they're fun. It's wicked fun. Don't get me wrong. I love that kind of deck. It's just not gonna. It's very hard for something like that to go to distance. At a really large event. These smaller ARGs maybe.
Say, like, those types of decks won't top, like we said earlier, locally, those 5 or 6 round ARG events, those 100 people events even, but to go and kind of stretch into like those really large scale events, it's going to be really, really difficult for those decks. Not impossible, but it's definitely going to be near impossible in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. Now, this reminds me of something that I want to talk to you about for sure, which is the sideboard, right? We're talking about horns in the sideboard for Yamada, that kind of thing. Right now, if we look at the meta, I mean, the meta shifts every week. Like, and it's because there's a lot of small events that the people, I think, weigh a little heavier than they should. But the meta's just swinging like crazy. So here's the question. Right now, there's like 6 viable decks, right? There's a lot of decks. How do you fit in a sideboard? Like, what are you really targeting? What are you going against?
Well, actually, right now, I feel like the sideboard has to be. You're almost most sideboards, like, because red is definitely the most dominant color. You'll see red in, I think, like 4 out of 6 of maybe 5 out of 6 competitive decks right now. Right. So most of the time, those sideboard options are actually clogged up. So you want to have those pieces that you're not going to be using, like those 4 or 5 cards. Not going to be using to be really central and to be interchangeable at all times. Because let's say you need those access to let's say you only run 2 Demon Flames main board, you go into game 2, where Thunders are a little bit less valuable than Demon Flames. Right. Because you already have that 1 card advantage. You don't want the damage, you want the destruction to maintain the board advantage because you're on the off play. Right. So in those situations, you want something that can be interchangeable for game 2 and 3, where it'll affect your outcome for the match overall, because you're going to have 4 Shays, 4 Death Sights, 1 Blazer, and maybe 2-3 Horns. You're already looking at 12, 13 cards in your sideboard. You only have room for 2 cards, which are going to be really crucial. Right. And that's assuming you're not running interchangeable rulers either. So. Right, yeah. God forbid you throw an interchangeable ruler.
and now the whole thing's super clogged because it's interesting because we ran into this problem. So Brian and I, we brought a modified Arla deck, pretty similar to the one that he won ARG State in Arizona with, except made some changes, took out what is it, Cinderella, or excuse me, Snow White. I'll always call it Cinderella. We took out Snow White's, and he put in Gillis, right, the dragon guy that flies with swiftness. Gilderoy, thank you. And that card's bananas, by the way. Like, we'll just win you almost any game. But so here's the thing. So we were like, we were talking about this deck, and we're working on the board, right? And we're talking about the board, and it's mostly him working on the board, and me going like, yeah, pal, right? Like, this is great. But we were main decking Death Scythe, right? And we were like, well, why are we going to board Blazer, for example? It's like Arla with 4 bows is very strong. It's not great against the Regalia deck, so we'll just take those out. But I feel like we're just faster than the Regalia deck, and the Regalia deck, there's already a ton of hate going on about it right now already in the sideboard. A lot of people are doing the Blazer and the Death Scythe thing. So we just feel like that deck's going to lose anyway. Let's take the risk. And neither of us played it the whole event. There's only one that whole event. Yeah. So there's times where you just kind of trust your gut, I guess, right?
I mean, there's going to be times you trust this. I still don't like that phrase per se. Like, I always go by probability.
Right.
Always go by probability. But kind of like what you said, going into rounds 4, 5, or 6, those decks are going to start falling off because they're going to lose to their own variance.
Right.
When they lose their own variance and you're playing consistently, at that stage of the game, you're not going to lose, likely.
Right.
You're not going to be playing up against those. You're not going to be losing against those. Those decks probably won't be seen.
Right.
So, kind of like what you said, like, you don't necessarily need those gimmicks as long as you don't play those, hit those like in the first few rounds.
Right.
And then you're safe anyway. So.
Right, right. Talk a little bit about losing to your own variance. I think that's something that not a lot of people know about, but it's a really, really big deal at events.
Okay, so basically when you go into like a big, large event, those big events, like, you can't really lose to... You will have, just based on probability, you will lose one game, very likely, just due to bad luck. And that's just really unfortunate. That's just random RNG that you have no control over. And that will happen typically once in a tournament. You can play the most optimal line of play every game. You can have a strong sideboard for games 2 and 3, and no one would anticipate. And yet, you still might fall victim to the RNG factor. And you have to accept you can lose one game.
Right.
But more than 2, that's going to eliminate you from top cut.
Right.
So losing to your own variance is basically, you don't want to build a deck where there's too much RNG, where it's going to prevent you from top 8ing, just because you lose once to luck, and then losing a second game to luck is just, you can't not even feasible. You have to have something consistent in order to make those rounds into the top cut. Right.
It's kind of the classic example of people new to TCGs where they go, well, I have a sideboard, I'm playing against all these meta decks, why don't I just run the sideboard in my main board? Now I have the answers to everything, right? Well, you're not going to have the right answer to the right thing at the right time. That's the issue. And what's funny, it's actually funny we come on this topic because it brings me to Vlad, right? Because Robert Boyashi just did really well with Vlad. He got top 4 at the ARG in Anaheim. And it was a really strong deck. And Brian and I, we talk about Vlad a lot because I'm a huge fan of Vlad. And Brian keeps telling me, like, the only problem with Vlad, the number one problem with Vlad is you have a lot of answers. But you have to make sure you get the correct answer you need for the correct situation that you have in front of you. If not, then great, you ran the answer, but you're holding the wrong one. So that's another thing. Like, Vlad, I think, is a really, really powerful deck, and I think, there's
a little more RNG in Vlad than opposed to aggro.
Right.
And I think that definitely plays into why Vlad is a little bit more subpar compared to other top tier decks. I'm not saying Vlad's weak. I'm saying it's a little bit subpar because it has a little more RNG factor to it, opposed to something like where you're relying on having that turn 2 Lancelot if you're on the play, and you play that Lancelot, you're putting a lot of pressure on the field. Board, and like, that's 3 pillars of resources that you're kind of establishing dominance on.
Right.
So.
Yeah, turn 2 Lancelot is, it's kind of crazy, man. That's a lot of damage to take turn 2. Look at some of the older decks, and of course, that's why they're not being played anymore, but back when we were playing with Abdul and Grim, that kind of output was just not possible. The most they could do is like 300 with a hunter.
I mean, if Lancelot was out when Abdul was out, like,
Different ball game.
Abdul would have been even a thing.
No, it couldn't have been because and with split, so you have split heaven and earth, and you have Lancelot. Forget about it, right? It's over at that point. But it's interesting because that's what I think is so unique because right over here, like you'll say, like, yeah, see, variance is something you really got to think about. Is my deck just going to lose because it doesn't have the right answers to the right thing at the right time? But then you have other players like Robert Boyajian, who's like, I think Vlad's the best deck in the format because it's just going to allow me to keep my opponent at bay, grind into the late game where I'll auto win. And he's right. Like, Vlad in the late game is near an auto win. How do you kill Vlad? Especially 20 stones. Yeah. Right? So
getting to that point is just very difficult. But you're right. Like, getting it's the problem. Yeah, like I said, like going into like later rounds, I'm not sure how effective Vlad is.
Right.
Because you still have the RNG effect. It's a very powerful deck. Don't get me wrong. Just has a little more RNG, kind of like what we were saying.
Right.
Opposed to something where like you're running red Arla, where you have just like constant pressure on the board and the field. And if you go on the play, let's say the Vlad player gets a bad does not get the right counters at the right time, and it's on the draw, 2 or 3 games, boom, that match is done for you.
Yeah, big time. And it's I don't know, it's interesting, man, because everyone thinks a little differently. And I mean, like for you personally, like right now in the meta that we're in, what do you feel? Maybe we haven't seen it yet, but the best deck or the one that you feel has the strongest matchups against the field as we see it today?
Honestly, like the current field, I think all these red deck variants are very, very up there in top tier. Maybe Arla edges out ever so slightly against the other top tier decks. And I think a lot of that kind of stems from Arla's power points. Like Arla has a lot of power points and not much weakness. Like let's for instance, like Vlad's weakness is getting to late game. If you can bypass that, a lot of times you can go if you can establish board pressure, enough damage in there. A lot of times you'll be able to fly in. Bahamut's weakness is, well, you're running a ruler-centric deck. Oftentimes you'll have Leviathan. If you're not using Leviathan, you're not going to be able to go in and J-activate. Otherwise, you could end up running a dead card, and you're dependent on Bahamut closing out those games. Right. So it's the Death Scythe and Blazer could definitely hinder that. A lot of these decks in the format do have these kind of like spikes. For Arla, you're okay with not playing those spikes. I mean, sure, Leviathan might be dead, 2 cards, but having a playset of Leviathan, 4 cards. Dead.
Right. Yeah. True.
And you still have access to bows.
Bow. I mean, there it is. Right. Like I think Artemis Bow. I mean, I would call it meta warping for sure. That card is out of control good.
It is. It bypasses a lot of the early game regression. It can put pressure on the field. In my opinion, I'm on this boat where it's like Ame no Hibikiri is probably one of the most dominant cards in the format. It's just being hindered by the fact that Bow is so prevalent. Right. So, like just seeing that, it's just very, very, like, I don't know. It's like a kind of like X beats Y beats Z counters Y and X in a way. So
almost rock paper and scissors, but throw in a little extra stuff in between.
Some maybe the machine gun.
Yeah.
A lot of different factors. Like one deck is definitely a little more edges out, I feel like, than the other deck, but all the decks in general just have a really, really strong. It comes down to a lot of times who goes first and who has that sideboard that can handle game 2 and 3 effectively. So.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's what you're looking at. Like especially, I mean, when you're looking at a current meta, you look at past events, right, and you see what you have. And here we have the past events are just so crazy. Like there's things topping that you're like, well, how did this, like Green Grim? Like, what are you even doing at a top table? Like, I'm confused. You know, there's things like that are just like, well, what do I really prep for? And you just have to think like, well, what's a real deck and what's not a real deck? You know, what am I actually scared of? What am I not scared of? And you know, sometimes you take risks, but it's like you were talking about before, statistics, right? Statistics, they don't lie. They're just the facts, right? So if you look at statistics, it'll tell you like, all right, well, I should really be prepping for Blazer Knights more than I should be prepping for Yamada, right? Well, then all of a sudden Yamada started popping up more. So you're like, okay, well, Yamada can be a little bit tough game one, but let me just throw in a couple of horns, and then they'll never bother me again for the rest of my life. So you're playing odds, you're playing averages like all the time, right? That's part of the game.
It's part of the game, and that's why sideboards exist. Like it's to prevent like certain decks, kind of keep things in line and keep your chances of winning to as high as possible. And that's a huge part of the game. Huge part of the game.
Yeah, it's really important. And I think like what a lot of people look for, because we're about to go into season 2, right? So we have all these new cards coming out, and the first event after the set releases, I believe that, it has to be, is the ARG in Vegas. That's going to be on the 11th or something like that. The set drops at 10th. I think it's actually the 12th or the 13th, one of the two. It's either Saturday or Sunday. And that's the most interesting, those are the most fun tournaments to be at, because are you just going to take some of the new cards, throw them in your current deck, and just run?
Expect to do great, yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's definitely a huge factor. And I think anyone that wants to kind of like go a safe route,
right,
just play something that's already established, something that has fast aggression, and all those cute decks might not make it. So.
Right. Like, because we look at like Refrain, right? Just an insane card, great card, and that's gonna be one of the top decks for sure. Like you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. Gonna be one of the top decks for sure. Here's the thing: how long? And this is actually, I think, a really good question. Is how long do you think it takes for a deck to come out, or whatever, a ruler to come out that's clearly going to be dominant before it actually gets to its most optimal state?
That's actually a really tough question, because, and I'm going to refer to the SKL format. So like this past format where we had a lot of, it kind of evolved, like kind of we said every week at one point.
Right.
Because what happened was Bahamut was such a dominant deck that when SKL released, there were so many counters to Bahamut. Well, not so many, just Death Scythe and Blazer.
Right.
Death Scythe Blazer became so prominent that Bahamut fell off. Because Bahamut fell off, all of a sudden you had Vlad, all these J-activating rulers taking the forefront again. So you have Vlad, Grim, I don't know, what's another one off the top of your head? Arla.
You're right, Arla, yeah.
Oh, so like, you have all these other ones. So once that happened, you saw people started to bring back Bahamut.
Right.
And that's why Bahamut was so successful, because kind of like Death Scythe went away, because it's going to be useless in that mirror against, Blazer versus Blazer, who's going to need Death Scythe? Like, a dead card. So it kind of evolved in that way to where it's kind of like become more finite now.
Right.
Where you have decks, but like, is it optimal to mainboard multiple, like a full playset of Death Scythes in the mainboard now?
No.
Exactly. Like, because you just knowing the matchups and stuff, it takes a while to get evolved to the point where it should. And I think a lot of players kind of like go into it expecting one thing, but don't foresee like sometimes they'll think like, okay, 2 steps ahead, and they kind of take 1 step back and realize this is a new meta. Everyone's going to be running Refrain Control, Refrain Aggro in Las Vegas, so it's not as like that. You can't think too far ahead into where will bows be prevalent if Refrain Aggro is too strong. What does that mean? Amino Habakiri will come back. Like it's just, you can't play that game. You have to just look at what's right in front of you in order for it to be really effective, I think, going into week 1.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's always the most interesting event, because some people try to just go ham and innovate, right? They want their name.
It's pretty cool. Like, you'll see like this rogue deck that one guy he goes 8-0 because he has a deck that no one's ever seen. Understand. The storms of tournaments.
That's Ernest right there. That's That's the Ernest that.
Yeah, that's what I try to do.
Right. I mean, that's what's so fun about those events. I really like the start of, because anytime it's like just really beginning of a meta being shaped is the most, you see the crowd follow, right? So whatever just hits hard in the beginning is going to get followed. Then the outliers are going to go, well, how do I beat this deck? Okay, well then how does this deck that beats that deck do against that one? Oh, all of a sudden this is the best deck of the format. And then another deck's like, I'll do the same thing that guy did to create the first deck. And then it's an everlasting cycle.
But then there's people that think start like have that go into week 1, expecting 2 steps ahead, are really effective going into week 5.
Right.
Where all of a sudden it's exactly how they anticipated the shape. They just wish they took that week 5 deck, not in week 1 for week 1.
So what we just, that was the most confusing string of sentences I've ever heard in my life. Where did we get? Where are we now? We're in the future. I'm confused. Get me out of here, dude. It's so crazy because especially when during a time when there's not a lot of events. Season 2, we're going to have a lot of events. It's going to be nice because actual meta will shape. But right now, I really feel like it's the Wild West. And people are just throwing whatever they can out there. I mean, I played against an Arla Angels deck. We actually just put it on the site for our creative corner, right? And it was Arla Angels. He called it Untouchable Angels. And it was playing whatever the big angel that gets the other big angel, right? Whatever their names are.
Yeah. Crazy. Actually, one of my friends created that almost exact same deck.
Oh, really?
All of a sudden might be doing better now.
Yeah, because Realm is such a good card. I mean, it's hard to deal with. Luckily, we boarded wolves, the little wolf that kills it. Which now that I think about it, was kind of strange that we did that. We weren't really preparing for Realm. I forgot what we were preparing for, but that card came in handy. That's why I won game 2. We ended up drawing me and that person. But you just realize when you can't target, it's the closest thing to a floodgate that Force of Will has. Is Realm, what is it, Realm of the True Spirit?
Yeah, Realm of the True Spirit, I think, yeah.
Yeah, it's the closest thing to a floodgate that we have, because, especially in Arla, everything targets.
Yeah.
Everything.
Definitely certain power points that can't be touched there.
Right, yeah, definitely.
So, I kind of want to talk about the kind of 4 pillars real quick.
Yeah, go.
For players that don't quite understand the competitive field when they're looking at it,
right?
If they're trying to go from kind of newer, I guess for newer players, if they're trying to go into the competitive scene, how do I look at cards? Do I take them at face value? Do I take at combos? There's different ways to kind of look at cards. I think the best approach is to understand there's 4 different resources in the game, and kind of take that into account. And I want to go over each one real quick.
Yeah.
So the first resource is going to be hand advantage. Without cards, you have less options. The more cards you have, the more options you control.
Right.
As the games go later stages, hand advantage is more and more crucial. The player with more cards usually can outlast their opponent. And with that being said, the second pillar is board state. And in my opinion, the most important one is going to be board state. The player who controls the board, I'm not sure if you know chess analogy, but the person with the control of the center of the board usually dictates the way the match unfolds.
Right.
It's very similar in most card games. If you have board pressure, board state, it's going to easily close out the third pillar, which is life. And you get to that win con a lot faster than any other advantage. Hand advantage is definitely very important. Board state is I think a little bit slightly ahead of hand advantage. You need to maintain each of these pillars on their own. The third pillar is life. And when I say life, it's true. Life is nothing but a resource. You have to accept what you can. You have to be willing to take damage, and you have to know what you can accept and what you can't accept. Just because someone's swinging in with you with a Gawain, can you afford to take 300, or do you want to lose that Cheshire to Gawain? You have to take those into account and kind of look into, can I afford to take this damage? If you can afford to take this damage, and it's not going to be a huge detriment, don't worry about it. You don't need to throw a familiar cat. You don't need to throw your Cheshire. You don't need to throw your blockers out for no reason. So life ain't nothing but a resource. As long as you have 100, you still have a chance to win the game.
Right, it's true. I've seen it.
Don't get a lot of newer players get really apprehensive when they see their life start falling.
Right.
And of course, the fourth pillar is your will control. How you manage your resources, your willpower, your stones, trying to keep them in check. And these 4 pillars are what kind of determine a good player from a great player. A player that can manage these 4 pillars effectively can easily navigate a game to their win condition.
Right.
And that's what I think is kind of the biggest, hurdle for newer players into the competitive scene. I know it's completely off track, but I really want to touch on
Right. No, it's not off track at all because it's. I think even players who feel that they are kind of competitive can still struggle in those areas. Like one of the most important ones is what you mentioned, or at least in my opinion, is can I afford to take the damage? Because that also talks like you're also talking about. You have to look. Okay, if I do this, and then it's my opponent's turn. What are they capable of? Right? That's huge. Like you have to think if I attack with, the best example is Lancelot, right? Like in the Arla mirror match, if I have Lancelot and I swing in with Lancelot, and my opponent brings down their Lancelot and kills it's horrible. Like, or not even like, whenever there's a situation where you're going to attack and it leaves yourself open or puts you in a position to where your opponent can take advantage of the fact you did that, you have to take into account. And that comes from knowing matchups and all that good stuff, I guess.
It is, but yeah, I kind of see what you're saying. Like if you play a Lancelot and they're on the draw, so they go second, they have a familiar cat on the field. Do they block the Lancelot or do they accept the 600 damage?
Right.
If that's the first source of damage, dropping them to 3,400, what else can they do to kind of recover from that?
Right.
So is it worth blocking 600? A lot of times I find myself saying, I can afford this set of damage. I'll save my familiar or Cheshire Cat for another block, or my personal for another block if I'm not anticipating certain things like flanking shout and stuff.
Right.
It's fine. Like a lot of times 600 damage is not going to make or break the game.
Right.
Having that first of all might help when I want to play my Lancelot, swing into their Lancelot, and then sack it off.
Right. So it's value.
Exactly. You have to balance the four pillars and see what you can afford to take.
Right.
Life especially, and that's the biggest trap for newer players.
Right. For sure. Yeah, definitely. Also, if you're blocking with a familiar cat, for example, a Lancelot, you lost something. They didn't. So that actually needs to be the biggest decision you make in the early game is it worth me losing my card on board to stop 600 damage to my face? That's a huge question. You should rattle your brain forever trying to calculate if that's the best decision in the matchup.
Exactly. It's definitely, because a lot of times it will come down to one or two cards in hand, or if it's aggro versus aggro, a little bit of life totals might make a difference.
Right.
But a lot of times I put a higher value on cards in hand and just accepting early game damage to establish that board presence.
Right, absolutely. Everything that you talk about is so important. We could talk forever on this stuff. People don't even know that Ernest and I have been on the phone like an hour before we even started recording because I'm terrible at computers and we're just talking. He's a super interesting guy, and I'm really glad you could make it on the show today. This has been so insightful. I'm glad you talked about the pillars. I think that's really important for players to hear about and learn more about in general. You want to shout out your store? Tell us what you're doing, what you're up to before I let you go here.
Sure. I'm very active in the area. We do a lot of, Curio's been doing a lot of Area G events recently. My area's been doing a lot better. It declined a little bit, but then kind of boosting back up. And I'm really happy to see the directions taking. Hopefully season 2 will come out and really put some, bring life back to the game. So I do see this game going pretty good places.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's great. The game has everything someone would want. It's Magic without lands in your deck, right? It's best.
Wow, and then there's an added layer of thought and process.
Right.
So low, the berries in this game are so they're.
Right. Yeah, they're there. They're right there. And I'm super excited for season 2. I know you are too. We're going to be seeing a lot of you. I know, with all these events coming up, and there's a lot on the East Coast and in the middle of the country. So we'll see a lot of Ernest. He's not going anywhere. Thanks for coming on the show. Remember to subscribe, comment on everything. And we'll be back next week. We'll have someone else on, and we'll keep you up to date. Ernest, if you have any cool stuff going on, you know where you can find us.
Yes, no.
Absolutely. All right, cool. Well, everybody, we'll see you next week.